One of the ways you can know that you really made it in your chosen profession in life is when you can be known or simply referred to by one name. Jordan, Cher, Bono, um, Johnny, Yoda. Okay, maybe not that last one as much. But you get where I'm going with this, right? That you need to maintain or attain a certain status, a certain preeminence in your field if you're going to get known by just one name. But usually, with all these different characters we've looked at here, there's just the one name that you're known by, right? So if you're Michelangelo, who on earth knows what Michelangelo's other name is, right? Or Presley, that doesn't really do as much for us. It's just really Elvis that we know. But I would say to you that there is in fact a character who is so famous and so preeminent in his field that he can really be referred to by either of his names simply as one name, and we all know who we're talking about. So we can refer to Thomas, or we can refer to Aquinas. And in both cases, as long as we're in the general realm of the theological or even broader Christian worlds, we know who we're talking about, right? So Thomas, of course, there's the apostle of the name, but typically in a theological discussion, if we're going to say Thomas says, we all know that we're referring to Thomas Aquinas, or obviously Aquinas says. So who is Thomas Aquinas, and how does he attain this level of preeminence in the field of theology? Well, we certainly can't do an exhaustive discussion of that, but what I'd like to do here in this module is to introduce you a little bit to Aquinas and introduce you to some of the key themes that we can find in his work, and then also give you a little guidance in terms of how to go about reading Aquinas' work if you want to do so on your own. Because even though he is preeminent in the field of Western theology, and many of us might have a desire to read some Aquinas to see what he has to say on different topics, it can be a little daunting if you don't have some introduction into how to go about reading Aquinas, and particularly reading his kind of ultimate work, the Summa Theologica. So we're going to provide an introduction to him, to his thought, and to the Summa here in this module. Now, I'm not going to spend a great deal of time introducing you to Aquinas in a sort of biographical sense. You can find the information about Aquinas' life in any number of places, online or in books or articles. There are a number of biographies about Aquinas as well. I'll just give you some of the key highlights here, right? Aquinas lives in the 1200s, lives from, we think, roughly 1225 to 1274. So this is once the scholastic movement is well underway at this point. He enters the Dominicans, and of course his family famously tries to dissuade him from doing that and basically locks him up for a year. And the legend is that they tried to send up a woman of ill repute to his cell to try to dissuade him from pursuing religious life, and he chased her off with a hot poker from the fireplace. So Thomas is very committed to pursuing his religious vocation. He enters the Dominicans, and very quickly thereafter becomes a teacher in the university. He teaches in Paris and begins writes on the sentences, as we talked about last time, writes a Summa contra Gentiles, which is a smaller Summa, right? And as I explained in the last module, in the medieval period, theologians would write Summas, right, which was a summary of theology. The Summa contra Gentiles is a summary of theology contra Gentiles, against the peoples, or really it's basically apologetics, right? It's meant to be a guide to Christian thought and theology to use in discussions with or debates with other peoples, whether they're Jews or Muslims would be the primary other figures, but also some schismatic or heretical groups as well. But after he writes that, he then dives into writing the Summa Theologica or Summa Theologiae, depending on how much you want to stick to the Latin. And in the Summa, he really attempts to cover basically the entirety of Christian theology. And we'll see as we go into talking about the Summa more specifically, he breaks it into 3 different parts and tackles whole different aspects of Christian thinking in the Summa, and puts it all together into an amazingly comprehensive, coherent system of thought. Now, right before he dies, he falls ill, and again famously declares that all his work is straw. Whether or not he's having some sort of a nervous breakdown, or whether he's been granted some sort of a vision of the divine that makes everything he's seen, or everything that he's written seem paltry in comparison, we don't really know. But he died shortly after that, a few months later, leaving the Summa unfinished, even though it pretty much covers the entirety of Christian theology as he had initially laid it out. And so that's kind of who Thomas is. Now, in the decades after his death, he didn't really have the prominence that he enjoys today. It took a little time for his school of thought to grow and become one of the leading schools of thought in the scholastic period. And then, of course, ultimately, it becomes kind of the definitive medieval or scholastic theology. And it has been referred to many times in subsequent church history. Different popes at different points of crisis in the history of the church have pointed back to Aquinas as really the key figure that we ought to focus on in thinking about how to think about our faith. Most recently, perhaps, John Paul II, in Fides et Ratio, looks to Aquinas as a central figure in thinking about how we should understand the relationship between faith and reason. So that's just a very quick synopsis of his life. And again, there are many places you can go to find a much fuller description of Thomas's life and work. But really, in many ways, his biography is somewhat interesting, but it's really his theological work, and in particular the Summa and the ideas he develops there that really get people's attention. And so what I want to do now is to turn to looking at some of the primary themes that we see running through this gigantic work, the Summa Theologica, and talk about how they can give us some general sense of Thomas's thought as a whole before we dive into the specifics of how to read specific articles in the Summa. Now, the challenge in trying to explain the key themes in the Summa is precisely captured by the name of the work we're trying to give the key themes of, right? This is a Summa Theologica. This is really a summary of theology as a whole. So again, trying to explain the key themes in here is basically trying to explain the key themes in Christian theology. Having said that, I think there are a couple of things that are particularly important in Aquinas' presentation of the faith, and that will be important for understanding some of the specifics I want to look at in a few minutes, but also are important in terms of thinking about Aquinas' impact on the larger tradition and how it's going to tie into some of the later controversies that we're going to look at, right? Because after Aquinas, certainly there are other medieval figures and controversies that we could look at, but we're going to move from Aquinas to the Reformation and to Martin Luther. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the ways that Aquinas provides a synthesis of doctrinal development up to his time as a way of kind of setting the stage for Luther and the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic response to it in the next module or two. So with those kind of purposes in mind, how would we talk about the key themes of the Summa Theologica? Well, one thing I think would be just to look at the basic breakdown of the work. And we can see, if you look at it, it's broken into 3 parts, although the middle part, the second part, itself has 2 parts to it, a first part of the second part and a second part of the second part, which is a little confusing, but there it is. The first part is really devoted to God, right? So this is theology in the strictest sense, right? This is thinking about God, thinking about his nature, and in particular thinking about the Trinity, right? And so in the first part we get Aquinas talking about God and the one God and how this one God is also in fact 3 persons. And here you can see, of course, something we talked about previously, this Latin approach to the Trinity, which really begins with the one and then is also going to talk about the 3. And as in most things, Aquinas brings together kind of thinking about the Trinity up to his day, particularly in the Latin-speaking West, and really gives a kind of definitive summary of it, explanation of it, up to his day. So that's the first part, right? And theology begins with, understandably enough, God and thinking about God. The second part really addresses human beings and human life, right? So it's going to talk about the nature of the human person. It's going to talk about, at some length especially, also ethics, and looking at all the different virtues and vices that we can find in human living. And this is something that we will spend a good deal of time looking at in the ethics course. We're going to use Aquinas as the foundation for thinking about and understanding Catholic ethics, because again, Aquinas really is the definitive figure when it comes to the development of Catholic ethics over the centuries. He kind of takes what had come before and puts it into a systematic, coherent account, and all the later figures in Catholic ethics really, in some way or another, address Aquinas and have to interact with him. But that second part really focuses on the human person and human life, and in particular ethics. And then the third part really shifts to thinking about the economy of salvation, right? How it is that salvation works. And we'll talk about the sacraments and salvation and all those things there in the third part. And all of this is aimed at, ultimately, I would argue, Thomas's goal, which he states very clearly in the work, what is the ultimate end of everything that we as humans do in this life, right? So he'll ask this question of what is the proper end of human beings. And in this discussion, when we talk about an end, we're talking about a goal or a purpose, right? So what is the ultimate goal? What is the ultimate purpose of all human actions, of all human choices? And this is kind of along the lines of having a conversation with, say, a 4-year-old, right, who keeps asking why. And Aquinas is doing a similar thing, right? So that when we say, well, why ought I do this good deed, or why should I avoid this sin, or why should I participate in this sacrament, right? Well, we can always point to something more immediate, right? Well, you should do this because it will help your mother or your brother. You should do this because it will help you develop the virtue of charity, or whatever it might be. But Aquinas is going to argue that if we push those questions far enough, the ultimate end that we will arrive at is the goal of the beatific vision, right? Of the direct relationship, direct communion between the human person and God, the Creator. That is going to be the ultimate goal. And that is really the ultimate goal of the Summa, is to explain how all the different facets of life, how all the different facets of our faith are connected to and lead us back to that ultimate end of the beatific vision. So obviously in talking about God, part of how we aim towards and strive for the beatific vision is to know God and to understand Him as best we can in this life. And that's really what is covered in the first part. In the second part, how we arrive at the beatific vision is to a large extent determined by, or made possible by, becoming more and more like God, and developing our virtues, developing our nature in the way God intended it to be developed, so that we become more and more like God, so that we can be in this perfect relationship with God in eternity. And of course, in the third part, talking about the process of salvation, obviously that connects in terms of thinking about how the sacraments, how Christ's work assist us and make possible that move towards God that will result ultimately in the beatific vision. And so all of these different minute questions that Aquinas will cover, and we'll look at some examples in a few minutes, ultimately they can all be tied back to this goal of attaining the beatific vision and talking about how men and women can do that. So that would be the primary thing, I think, to keep in mind when we're looking at the Summa. Because as we'll see, it's broken into kind of very specific questions and very specific sub-questions. And so sometimes it's common to get lost in the details, right? That we get caught up in these very specific issues in one tiny part of the Summa and we can kind of miss the forest for the trees in a very straightforward sense. And we always need to step back and think about the fact that all of this in Aquinas' mind is pointing back towards this union of God and man in the beatific vision. And of course, hopefully, as you'll see at this point in the class, right, this really ties Thomas into the larger theological tradition up to this point, right? That all these different debates we've been looking at, all these different figures we've looked at, the overriding goal in all of them has been to talk about and explain and assist human beings getting in this right relationship with God, and ultimately being in this perfect relationship with God, which we can refer to as the beatific vision. And so Aquinas is doing that just as much as, say, Athanasius is when he talks about the nature of the incarnation against the Arians. So that would be the first and major point. Now, to do that, to explain how the beatific vision might be possible and how we as human beings could get there, Aquinas is going to address, as I've said, the whole range of Christian living and Christian thought. But there are some kind of key themes that stand out and that are going to be important as we move forward in theological history. Right, one of the primary themes that we see in Aquinas is talking about and thinking about the relationship between faith and reason. Right, and in all of these different questions and articles that make up the Summa, what's going on, of course, is a very brilliant mind reflecting on and thinking about the faith. And so obviously Aquinas, as a very insightful thinker, is going to recognize that, you know, if he's going to write this huge work addressing in very specific detail all these different questions about the faith, he's going to need to talk about what is the proper relationship between faith and reason. Right? And he does this, really provides sort of the definitive Catholic view of the relationship between faith and reason. Right? So he lays this out in some detail, explaining how faith and reason are not contradictory. Right? So one of the options for thinking about how faith and reason relate is to say, well, look, one or the other just doesn't work. And we can see this in our own day, and the same was true back in Aquinas' day, right? That there are going to be some figures who just reject faith, who say the only things that we can know, the only things that are true, are things that we can know through human reason, and that human reason is the only way to know truth. So we obviously see this in many prominent critics of Christianity and religion in general in the world today. And there were figures like this in Aquinas' day too, although perhaps not as famous and outspoken as in our own day. On the other hand, right, there are figures who would really reject the role of human reason when it comes to thinking about or talking about God or our faith. And they would say, we can't trust human reason. Human reason doesn't have a role to play. We should just accept everything by faith. We shouldn't be thinking about trying to make these fine distinctions about our beliefs. We just take everything by faith. Right? This would be fideism, where reason isn't really going to enter into our faith. But of course, Aquinas would argue, right, that this doesn't reflect how human beings work, and of course it opens us up to all kinds of problems. If God is the creator of human beings and is the creator of our reason, he gave it to us for a reason. He wants us to use our reason, right? And Aquinas will argue that faith and reason should work together, that both are needed in order to really know reality, that God designed it to work this way. And if you looked at reality as a whole, as Aquinas will explain, look, there are some things that reason addresses and that reason really properly deals with. Figuring out lots of the different issues that science will cover, right? So thinking about how the weather works, or thinking about how plants grow, or any sort of thing like this, right? That this is something that falls within the realm of human reason. And we have the tools given to us by God to really arrive at the truth about these things. On the other hand, there are certain things that we can know only by faith. So there's the Trinity, there's the Incarnation, there's all kinds of divine mysteries that we couldn't figure out just by using our reason. And so God has had to reveal these things to us through miracles, through the Incarnation especially, through revelation and the inspiration of the authors of Scripture. So there are some things that God reveals just by faith. And so if we take reason and faith together, they're going to kind of cover the realm of possibilities when it comes to knowing about reality and knowing what is really true. And Aquinas really explains this and gives an underlying account of faith and reason that really then allows for the Catholic understanding of the relationship between the two up to our current day, right? As I just said, John Paul II's Fides et Ratio, faith and reason, draws on and is really rooted in Aquinas' understanding of how faith and reason ought to relate. And we'll look at this a little more specifically as one of our examples in a few minutes, but I want to talk about a couple of the other key themes first before we get there. In some ways analogous to this discussion of the relationship between faith and reason, Aquinas will also talk about the relationship between nature and grace. And just as when it comes to knowing, human beings have certain kind of natural capacities, and then there are also supernatural gifts given to us in terms of revealed knowledge and infused faith. The same is true in other parts of life, in other parts of human existence, right? That we have certain natural capacities, certain natural ends that we can work for on our own, that we could attain. But then there are supernatural, there's grace given above and beyond what we can do by nature. This is another thing that Aquinas develops in the Summa that is really important in the subsequent tradition, right? Is talking about this relationship between nature and grace. And this will be important again when we come to Luther, right? Because one of the things we'll see in Luther, echoing some of the things we saw in Augustine, is a real denigration of human nature, right? That because of original sin, human nature has been totally corrupted and is really incapable of any good on its own, let alone, of course, a relationship with God. But Aquinas, kind of in the middle of Augustine and Luther, if you will, this isn't really his position, right? That he's going to talk about human nature as a good thing, right? That God created human nature good. And he gave us real capacities as human beings, whether it's our intellect or our will. And that human beings aren't totally corrupted by sin. Now, of course, original sin is real and has real effects on human nature and does diminish our ability to do the good that God designed us to do. But Aquinas is still going to point out that there are natural virtues that we can have. There are natural goods that we as human beings can reach for. And that's an important step in the development of the Catholic understanding of the human person. Now, what Aquinas will say is, we were never designed to just be natural, right? And this is a key point that will come up later on when we get to some of the 20th century debates and the Nouvelle Theologie, right? Because some scholastics took Aquinas' ideas and kind of carried them further and basically developed this argument for a purely natural human existence as a real possibility, and then would argue that a relationship with God is something that's just kind of added on top of that. And it kind of draws this divide between the natural and the supernatural. And again, we'll get to that later. But in Aquinas, that's not the way it works, right? Aquinas will talk about virtues that we can have as part of our human nature, or goods that we can attain, or good capacities that human beings have by nature. But from the outset and throughout, he's always going to see the human person as created for this relationship with God and the beatific vision, right? We don't exist purely naturally, and then somehow kind of this God bit, this beatific vision bit kind of gets added in afterwards, right? We were designed from the beginning for this relationship with God. And so nature and grace, if you will, are designed to work together from the beginning, very much like faith and reason work together. Right, and so what grace does is it enables us to go beyond what we could do just on our own, to enter into this relationship with God. And in terms of, say, ethics, we can see this very clearly, right? That there are the cardinal virtues. There are virtues that we can have just as human beings, but then there are also theological virtues. There are virtues that we can receive only by God infusing them within us: faith, hope, and love. Right? That these virtues are not things we develop on our own. We need grace in order to have these virtues, as Aquinas will explain them. And so, again, there's this nice balance that we can find in Aquinas, analogous to the relationship between faith and reason. On a broader scale, he's going to see this nice relationship between nature and grace, where from the beginning we are made good. We have a good nature, albeit one corrupted by original sin. But from the beginning it was designed to have grace added to it as well, so that we could attain that beatific vision, which is the ultimate goal of human life. Okay, so now that we've talked about some of these very broad themes that we see at work in Aquinas, and talked a little bit about his overall goals, his overall understanding of the faith, what I want to do is to turn now to much more specific information, and to talk to you about how to go about reading Aquinas. And I'm going to walk you through a couple of examples here in a moment, looking at some kind of really big issues in Aquinas, and then also some much more specific issues, just to give you a sense of how Aquinas thinks about things. But in general, let me explain the basic structure of how Aquinas writes, so that you have a sense of what's going on when we go to these examples, or hopefully when you go on your own to look at Aquinas. Now, for many of you, probably most of us don't have a copy of the Summa sitting on our shelves. It's a huge work, multiple volumes, although there are certainly many nice editions of it out there, and you can get it with the Latin and the English on facing pages, and it's all kinds of nice editions for you. So it certainly would be something worth getting if you're so inclined. But for most of us, and really kind of what I use on a day-to-day basis if I want to look something up, is online. And if you go to the New Advent site online, they have the Summa in a very nice user-friendly format there. So if you go and look at the Summa on New Advent, you'll see there kind of this breakdown that I've described to you, right? That there is the three main parts with 2 parts to the second part. And you can see a description of the basic topics covered in each part. And then if you go and within the part, so if you click on the first part or the second part, or if you have a written version, right, if you turn to the next index, you'll see that each part is broken into a large number of questions, right? And so they're called questions. That's kind of the terminology from Aquinas' organization, but really for kind of modern purposes, those would be best thought of as chapters, right? And that's going to give you kind of a general topics that Aquinas is going to be covering within the different parts. So right within the first part about God, there's going to be all these specific questions or chapters dealing with specific aspects of our understanding of God. So you can scroll through and look at all these different questions and kind of find the general area that you're interested in. So then if you click on one of the questions, that will then bring up another level, right? And there you'll find for each question a list of articles. Now sometimes it's only, say, 2 articles. Sometimes it will be many more. It could be a dozen articles. And these articles, these are really the basic units of the Summa, right? So it's really the articles where you get to the meat of the Summa, the actual content that Thomas has written. And so each of the articles is kind of a sub-question, if you will, of the broad question that the different parts are made up of. So you have the part, and then the question, which is kind of a chapter or broad area, and then the articles, which are specific questions that Aquinas is going to write out answers to. So if we turn to an article, if you choose an article, then you're going to see, again, it's not just straight text. It's not just straight prose. So if you went to, say, a modern summary of theology, right? So if you're going to read somebody's kind of definitive theology of some modern theologian, when you go to the chapter, you're just going to find, kind of written out. Maybe there's going to be some subsections, but They're just going to explain to you, okay, this is what I think about the Trinity. But when we turn to an article in Aquinas, we run into something different, right? And so it's important to know what's going on here to be able to make sense of trying to read some Aquinas. And just so you know, Aquinas isn't crazy for writing this way. We need to think back to what scholastic theology is, right? If you remember from the previous module, what are the scholastics doing, right? The scholastics are taking this huge tradition that they have access to, right? They have all these church fathers. They have philosophy, and especially, right, if you'll recall, they've been reintroduced to Aristotle. So when you're reading the Summa, if you see a reference to the philosopher says, when Aquinas says the philosopher, he's referring to Aristotle, right? So for scholastic theology, philosophy really is epitomized by Aristotle, that he's going to be their ultimate philosophical authority. So we've got church fathers. He'll talk about Augustine, he'll talk about Gregory the Great, he'll talk about all these other patristic figures. He'll talk about Aristotle philosophy. Of course, there's also sacred scripture that's going to come up in practically every article. There will also be references to some other medieval theologians, previous scholastics, and we'll also even see some references to Jewish or Muslim scholars, particularly when they are commenting on Aristotle, right? So if you'll remember, the scholastics get their Aristotle through Islam, right? And so those Islamic scholars wrote their own commentaries on Aristotle, and there are Jewish scholars who did the same. And so Aquinas knows about them, and he will refer to them at times. But primarily, the key material that Aquinas is going to be working with is scripture and this patristic tradition that he's going to get from things like Peter Lombard's sentences. Right? And if we recall, what is scholastic theology doing? Right? It's trying to take this tradition that it's received and put it into a coherent whole. And of course, as we talked about, the real challenge here is that there are going to be a lot of tensions, if not contradictions. Right? So if I have 3 or 4 different patristic sources and a couple of key biblical passages, and they all seem to be saying something a little different about my topic, what do I do? Well, scholastic theology is aiming to fit those things together to show that there aren't really fundamental contradictions. Or if there are disagreements, to kind of explain who's right and why and what we should think of these other passages. So that's what's going on when we turn to these articles in the Summa, right? And so the first thing you will see are objections. And this is confusing, but the first thing you'll see when you go to read an article are statements that Aquinas is ultimately going to disagree with, right? So you'll start off with 1, 2, 3, maybe more objections, giving statements from different authorities, scripture, patristics, Aristotle, that seem to contradict the conclusion that he's going to read, or that he's going to reach, rather. So when you start reading the article, the first thing you read, you can know this is the wrong answer, basically. These are going to be the difficult sources that Aquinas is going to have to explain how we should understand them. So we'll get the objections, the things he's not going to ultimately agree with. Then we get the on the contrary, right? And this is basically the pivotal authority that's going to shape Aquinas' answer. So we've got this big list of patristic or scriptural sources. There's going to be one that he's going to select as this is really the definitive text that's going to give us the right understanding of this issue overall. So we'll get an on the contrary, Aristotle says this, or on the contrary, the Gospel of John says this. And that's going to be the pivotal authority for him. Then what we're going to get is his answer, right? So he's going to answer that I've got this conflict, he's going to say, between these objections and this authoritative text. I'm going to answer that this is how we understand it, right? And so this is where Aquinas is going to give his own explanation of the issue, rooted in that on the contrary authority that he cited. So this is kind of the middle of the article. This is where he's going to, again, write out his understanding, how we should think about the answer to the question being posed in the article. And this, again, can vary very greatly in length. Sometimes these are very short. Sometimes we get a lot of text and explanation here. But he's going to give that explanation and where he answers. And then the final part of the article is going to be his reply to the objections, right? And this is a very interesting bit. There's a tendency sometimes to just skip to the I answer that, or the on the contrary, and then the answer. And that's where we're going to get Aquinas' view. But it's also, I think, interesting to go and look at those replies to the objections, right? Because this is where Aquinas is going to do that crucial step in scholastic theology to explain why the other authorities that he cites in the objections aren't really wrong, at least in most cases, right? So he's going to say, well, people who use Augustine to make this point, or people who use the book of Matthew to make this point, they're using it out of context. Or if we look at Matthew in this way, we'll see that it really fits with the position I've described. And so again, I would encourage you, when you read Aquinas, to go ahead and read those too, because there's a lot of times some important insights there in explaining how these authorities that seem to contradict his answer are in fact compatible with it, or that people who use authorities in other ways are misusing them or taking them in the wrong sense. So that's basically the way the Summa works, so that when you get down through the part to the question and then to the article, and you sit down to read the article, that's where you're going to find the meat of Aquinas. And you have to remember that the first things you read are going to be the objections, which he disagrees with. It's going to be the middle part where he lays out his position, and then he's going to end it up by explaining why those objections don't really contradict the position that he's describing in the article. Now that we've talked about kind of these broad themes in the Summa, and we've looked at the makeup of an article and how to read one, I want to conclude the module by looking at a couple of articles, both to give us some practice reading articles in the Summa, and also as a way of providing some evidence or reinforcing some of the points I've made about what Aquinas is trying to do in the Summa as a whole. And so to do that, for my two examples, I want to take both of them from the Secunda Secundae. That is the second part of the second part. And this is going to really be focusing on the different virtues and vices, right? This is the section of the Summa where Aquinas is explaining how we as human beings ought to live if we want to live both in keeping with our nature, and more importantly, if we want to live in a way that's going to allow us to develop our virtues and ultimately be in a position where we're able to enjoy the beatific vision, perfect relationship with God in eternity. And so there's a couple different examples from that Secunda Secundae that I want to look at. The first one is kind of a big important topic, right, where Aquinas is talking about the basic relationship between faith and reason, right? And faith is one of those, if you'll recall, theological virtues, right? These are one of the virtues that tradition is going to say has to be given to us by God, right? That we can't attain the virtue of faith on our own. So how does Aquinas explain this? How does he approach this? Well, let's look specifically at the article here, right? So this is from question 6 of the Secunda Secundae, article 1, whether faith is infused into man by God. And you can see here, right, so this is the question, right? Is faith something that we can have on our own? Is it part of our own natural faculties as human beings? Well, what's Aquinas going to say? Well, right, first we get the objections, right? And remember, these are going to be the things that he's going to disagree with. So he starts off by saying, it would seem that faith is not infused into man by God, right? So we already know, even stopping at this very first line, what his answer is going to be, right? It's going to be the opposite of that. His answer is going to be that faith is infused into man by God. But we're not going to skip there quite yet. We're going to look at this objection, right? And so we can see, he goes on, for Augustine says in De Trinitate 14, that science begets faith in us and nourishes, defends, and strengthens it. So you can see here a concrete example of what I've been talking about in scholastic theology, right? That he's got this quotation from Augustine's De Trinitate that he is going to need to explain, because it says science begets faith. And that seems to be contrary to the conclusion that he's going to reach. So we can see here scholasticism at work. What are we going to do with this quotation that seems to say that faith comes from science, that is, from our use of natural reason and our way of knowing things? So that's going to be objection 1. Objection 2 we get another authority that seems to contradict what he wants to say. Right, that we believe through seeing, and we believe through hearing, right? And he quotes two passages from Scripture, a passage from John and a passage from Romans. And basically both seem to imply that we receive faith through hearing and seeing things, whether it's miracles or hearing an account of the faith given to us by a preacher, which seems to again say that faith comes out of human reasoning. And then finally, objection 3, we get another quotation from Augustine. Now they're, not all of his sources from the patristic material are from Augustine, but I think it's a fair representation here, right, that Augustine is going to be the primary Western Church Father, and so he's going to get more citations than any other Church Father in the Summa. But here we have, again, another quotation that seems very problematic from on predestination of the saints. Faith depends on the believer's will. Right? So again, it's going to seem like we choose as human beings to have faith, therefore it can be acquired by human beings. All right. Now, where are we going to see Aquinas' own view? Well, here we get to it. On the contrary, it is written in Ephesians 2, 8, and 9, which you'll recall is a pretty important passage in this whole question of grace and election and all of that. By grace you're saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. So for Aquinas, this key passage is going to be Ephesians 2, 8, and 9, which clearly says that we don't get faith from ourselves. So, now how is he going to explain his position? Right? Well, he basically gives that here in his answer. Right? He's going to say there are two things that go into faith. The things which are of faith need to be proposed to us. And then the second thing is that we need to assent to the things that have been proposed. So he's going to break faith into these two parts, right? That we need to have what it is we're having faith in, and then we have to have the act of faith, which is believing with assent. And so he's going to explain how when we think about faith this way, this is going to make sense of things. There are some things in faith, he says here in that first paragraph, that surpass human reason. Hence, they do not come to man's knowledge unless God reveals them. Right? And so these would be supernatural things, right? Whether it's the incarnation or the Trinity or the mysteries of salvation, right? That here Aquinas is saying there are certain things that we believe by faith that we couldn't arrive at through our use of reason. God has to reveal them to us. Then he's going to go on in the next paragraph to talk about our assent to them, right? So once these ideas are proposed to us, how do we have faith in them? Well, he's going to say here too we need to talk about two different things. There's two causes. There's a kind of external inducement. There are things outside of ourselves that encourage us to believe and assent to things. So we could see a miracle. We could get an explanation from somebody who believes these things. So that's going to be part of the cause of our belief, or can be. But he's also going to say that when we're talking about the cause of faith, there also has to be within us some movement of the will, right? That we have to assent to whatever's being proposed. Even if I see a miracle kind of verifying some belief, I still have to make this move within myself to assent to it, to say, yes, I believe that. And here you'll see, interestingly enough, right, Aquinas picking up on what we've talked about previously with Augustine, talking about the Pelagians, right? And so Aquinas is going to disagree with the Pelagians as well and say the Pelagians held that this first step is something that we as human beings can do. It's in our power to assent to the things which are of faith. But he says, of course, this is false, right? That when we assent to the matters of faith, these things that are beyond our ability to know naturally, we're raised above our nature, right? So there must be some supernatural principle working within us, and that's God. Therefore, faith, as regards the assent, which is the chief act of faith, is from God moving inwardly by grace. Now you'll see here, again, right, Augustine at work. This very much sounds like Augustine talking about God moving within us to give us this faith, to cause us to assent to these things of the faith. Now, when we get into Aquinas in more detail, I think we'll find more room for kind of authentic free will than we will, say, in the very last writings of Augustine. But I brought this to your attention just so that you would recognize that even though we may have a lot of issues with Augustine's ideas about predestination or God working within even believers, this is very much continued and picked up in Aquinas. So there we have Aquinas' answer, right? That faith does depend on God, that some of the things that we believe by faith have to be revealed to us by God, and that then when we assent to these things, that God has to be at work within us through grace, helping us, causing us to believe. Now we end up, of course, the article with his replies to the objections. So he's going to say, basically, kind of as I've been talking about scholasticism all along, right, that the objections aren't really objections, that if you see them as saying that faith comes from science, you're just understanding them in the wrong sense. So he'll say that first quotation from Augustine is talking about external persuasion, right, that we can get an understanding of things, say, from science that will assist us in believing, or that will prompt us to believe, but we still have to have inwardly this act of faith moved by God. And he's going to go on again to make similar points about the quotations from Scripture and the other quotation from Augustine. So that's kind of a walk through this key article looking at the nature of faith and how it relates to human reason. So you can see there both, yes, this is really what Aquinas says. He really sees this close relationship between faith and reason, with both being a necessary part of the Christian life. And you can also see basically just how an article works. Now that we've looked at this big important issue of the nature of faith and reason, I want to wrap up by looking probably at a much less cited article, looking at the question of whether there is a sin in the lack of mirth. So, is lack of mirth a sin? Well, question 168 here of the Secunda Secundae is asking this, and specifically Article 4. What's going on here? Well, obviously this is not a huge kind of pivotal question in theological history like the relationship between faith and reason. It's asking, is lack of mirth a sin, right? Or put it more in our own language, is it a sin to be a sourpuss? Is it a sin to be perpetually gloomy around others? Or we could put it maybe in terms of children's literature, is Eeyore sinning? I think Eeyore would be kind of the perfect literary example for this question. Now again, this isn't a huge theological issue of great import. There probably aren't a lot of commentaries written on this article. So why do I bring it up? Well, again, I bring it up to bring home the point of the comprehensive nature of the Summa, right? That the Summa has all kinds of articles dealing with all sorts of issues that might never have come to mind for us, right? And one of the things I think that's actually very enjoyable about the Summa is that you can come to it over and over and over again and find new and interesting things there. I've never sat down and read the Summa. I don't know many people who've ever actually done such a thing. It would take quite a while. But I use the Summa all the time, right? And I'm still struck by how often I'll just be kind of browsing around on some subject looking for something or another, and I find these interesting little tidbits like this one. There's another article on the question of whether or not it's a sin for women to wear makeup. I'm steering clear of that one because my wife has warned me that I might be getting myself in trouble by going there. So we'll stick with the question of Eeyore for now. But that's just to make the point of there's a whole host of different things that Aquinas looks at, which can be very interesting. It's like going to a good bookstore and just browsing around and seeing what you might find. Cruising around the Summa is like that in many ways. But on a more serious note, one of the things I think that's important about this and why Aquinas does that is he really believes that all of these different issues ultimately are important, and they ultimately do tie back to the essentials of our faith, and they ultimately then tie back to this question of, or the aim of, attaining the beatific vision, right? That It's not just the huge decisive moments in our life that matter. There are countless little daily choices that we make, little actions that we perform, that Aquinas is going to say, yes, these do matter, and he's going to explain to us why they matter and how they matter. So I think we can see that here when we take a look at this article about whether it's a sin to be gloomy all the time. So what does Aquinas have to say about this? Well, let's look. All right, so objection 1, it would seem there is no sin in lack of mirth. So again, right, we know right here from the beginning what the answer is going to be. The answer is going to be that yes, it is a sin to lack mirth. But getting back to the objection, for no sin is prescribed to a penitent. But Augustine, speaking of a penitent, says, let him refrain from games and the sights of the world, and so on and so forth. Therefore, there's no sin in the lack of mirth. So obviously he's going to say, look, you don't get assigned a penance of sinning. That would be sort of self-defeating. Now, one of the things here that's interesting to note, right, is you'll see this authority that he's citing here from Augustine is on True and False Penitence, 15. But you'll see the note from the modern editor saying that this is spurious, right, that this is not really a work by Augustine. And you will come across this in the Summa, right, that there are a number of works by different patristic authors that in the medieval period they thought were by these famous authors, whether it's Augustine or Ambrose or someone like that. But later scholars have discovered, in fact, that it's not by Augustine or Ambrose. And this doesn't mean necessarily that somebody was trying to deceive everyone. A lot of times what would happen, kind of the ancient passing down of these texts, is that texts would just get put together into these volumes by editors really thinking they were from Augustine or Ambrose, and that just would get passed on through the centuries. And so they didn't have the kind of textual tools and literary tools to determine that they really are different authors, and we have them today. So that's just something to be aware of. You'll see, moving on then just to the next couple of objections, we can see how he's again going to be talking about Scripture, and he's going to be talking about, again, pagan philosophers again. On the contrary, right, the philosopher in his Ethics reckons the lack of mirth to be a vice. Right, so we can see here too, right, how scholastic theology works, drawing on these different sources. And he's going to answer, right, explain what's going on. We can see in the explanation, he's going to quote Seneca, right, another ancient philosopher, a Stoic philosopher. And you can see, of course, that he's getting his Seneca through this other source, Martin of Braga, and his compilation of ancient philosophy. And so again, you'll see this quite often in the modern editions. They'll tell you that a lot of times when scholastics, including Aquinas, cite classical sources, they're really getting them from compilations closer to their own time. But getting back to kind of the real question at hand, why would it be a vice to lack mirth, or why would it be a vice to be gloomy? And basically, you can see here, right, that well, whatever is against reason is a sin. Well, what's against reason here? Well, it's against reason for a man to be burdensome to others by offering no pleasure to others and by hindering their enjoyment. What is he saying here? Well, he's going to talk about how Aristotle will say that you need to be enjoyable around other people. Well, why is that? Right. Well, Aristotle would say, right, what's the ultimate goal of life? For Aristotle, the ultimate goal is not the beatific vision, because he's not a Christian. He doesn't believe in God in that way. Aristotle would say the ultimate goal of life is to live a flourishing life, a truly fulfilled human life, right? And to live a truly fulfilled human life, you need to be social, right? That Aristotle would say we are by nature social beings. And you have to have good relationships with others in order to be a truly fulfilled human person. So if you're perpetually gloomy, if you're depressing for other people to be around, this is going to work against you having good relationships with others. And so therefore, this is going to be a vice. It's going to be something that's contrary to true human flourishing. Now, when Aquinas picks that up, he's going to accept those ideas, but he will take it further, right? That our ultimate goal as human beings for Aquinas is to become like God so that we can be with God in eternity and enjoy the beatific vision. And again, part of being like God is having good relationships. But again, for a Christian, our good relationships, we're going to be practicing true Christian love. That is, seeking the true good of other people. That we're going to want them to flourish and to themselves become more like God. And we need these good relationships with one another to do that. So if our gloominess is standing in the way of having real meaningful relationships with others, not only are we not becoming more like God, but we're actually standing in the way of others doing the same. And so, being gloomy all the time is in fact going to be a sin for Aquinas, for precisely those reasons. Right now, you'll notice here, of course, in the second paragraph, he's going to add a little caveat, right, and say, this doesn't mean you go around being silly all the time, right? And in fact, it's worse to be silly than to be gloomy, because being silly is going to be a bigger obstacle to fulfilling our nature and to attaining the beatific vision. But still, being gloomy all the time is going to be a sin, because it stands in the way of good relationships, which is part of how we ultimately are going to attain the beatific vision. Okay, and then of course he's going to go on and explain the objections, right? And noting that when we look at the objections, we're talking about very specific circumstances. So in the first one, well, when you're being penitent, you aren't mirthful because you're lacking in mirth for a very specific reason to fulfill your penance. But that once your penance is fulfilled, then you ought to be a pleasant person to be around again. The same is true for the biblical quotations, right? That we're talking about either avoiding an excess of mirth in one case, or we're talking about a specific period of mourning in another, right? And so, again, we can see in these objections how Aquinas is going to go through and explain why his authorities that seem to disagree with his conclusion don't really do that. But again, I think this is just a very interesting article, right? To get this idea of whether or not it's a sin to be gloomy all the time, and to see how, in fact, it does tie into the much bigger picture in Aquinas' thought, right? That it's a vice, that it stands in the way of your development of the virtues, it stands in the way of your development of relationships with others, which ultimately stands in the way of you attaining the beatific vision and helping others attain the beatific vision. And so we can see here, I just think, a wonderful example of Aquinas at work, thinking about how all different aspects of life can ultimately be understood to fit together to help us attain that ultimate end of the human person. And really, Aquinas isn't just aiming to explain this. I think what is really going on in the Summa is this is Aquinas' effort, not just to explain it, but to really help others attain that goal. That by explaining these things to us, he's going to make it more possible for us to ultimately attain that beatific vision. And Aquinas isn't just a dusty old philosopher. He's somebody really thinking about human life as a whole and thinking about the best way to live so that we can all ultimately attain that goal of the beatific vision with God in eternity. Okay, well, we will leave that there for now. And again, I would certainly encourage you, now that you maybe got a little practice and guidance, to dive into the Summa and find all kinds of other interesting little tidbits in there. But in the meantime, I will look forward to hearing your thoughts on this and your questions and comments on the discussion board.